Final script TTS, the number one cause of narcissism, this toxic family dynamic. If you're watching this video, there's a very good chance you were raised in a family dynamic that Carl Jung identified as the root cause of narcissism. And the most unsettling part, you probably never even realized it, because this dynamic doesn't happen through obvious abuse, through explicit violence. It happens silently, in the space between what's said and what's never spoken. Between what's shown and what remains deeply hidden. Jung spent decades studying the families of narcissists, and what he discovered goes against everything pop psychology has led you to believe. Narcissism isn't caused by overly doting parents. It's not caused by parents who heap on too much praise. It's not caused by spoiling or excessive attention. That's the convenient lie we've been told to avoid, confronting a much darker truth. The family dynamic that creates narcissists is far more subtle, far more invisible, and far more devastating. Because it goes like this. There's a child, and there are two parents who, instead of seeing that child as a complete human being with legitimate emotional needs, see that child as an extension of themselves. It's not that they don't love the child, it's that their love is conditional on something very specific. And that something is what Jung called unresolved parental projections. Let me translate that into language you can feel in your own story. Your parents had dreams, they had ambitions, they had an idealized image of who they wanted to be. But for reasons they never processed, never resolved, never even admitted, they failed to realize those dreams. They didn't become who they wanted to be. And instead of doing the psychological work of accepting that, of processing the pain of that frustration, they did something much easier, much more destructive. They projected all of that onto you. You became the vehicle through which they would finally realize their unfulfilled dreams. And that sounds beautiful when you put it that way. It even sounds motivating. But what happens in practice is devastating. Because now everything you do, everything you are, needs to serve that projection, needs to validate their fantasy, needs to compensate for their emptiness. And here's the exact mechanism that creates narcissism. You learn that your existence only has value when it's serving that projection, when it's being successful on their terms, when it's filling the emotional hole that they never filled in themselves. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly. Parents who never became doctors creating kids who desperately need to be doctors, not because the child wants to, but because the child's emotional existence depends on validating the parent's unfulfilled dream. Moms who were never recognized, creating kids who desperately need constant recognition. Dads who never felt special, creating kids who need to prove they're special all the time. And you might be thinking, but a lot of parents want their kids to be successful. What's the difference? The difference lies in the subtlety of the emotional mechanism. Healthy parents want you to be successful so that you're happy. Parents with unresolved projections want you to be successful so that they feel complete. Healthy parents celebrate your achievements as yours. Parents with unresolved projections claim your achievements as validation of their worth as parents. Can you feel the difference? In one case, you're a separate human being who's being supported. In the other case, you're an extension who's being used. And the child feels that. They might not have words to describe it, they might not understand it consciously, but on the deepest level of the psyche, the child feels that their value as a person is not inherent. It's conditional. Conditional on performance, conditional on success, conditional on being who they need you to be so that they feel complete. And here begins the formation of narcissism. Because what happens when a kid grows up feeling that their value is conditional? when they grow up feeling that they constantly need to prove that they deserve to exist, when they grow up with the repeated experience that love and validation only come when they're performing a specific role, they develop what Jung called an inflated persona. The persona is the social mask that we all wear. It's normal to have a persona. It's healthy to have a persona. The problem happens when the persona becomes so inflated, so large, so important, that it replaces the true self. When you're no longer using a mask to navigate the social world, you've become the mask. And why does this happen? Because for a child raised in this dynamic, the mask is the only part of them that's ever received love, the only part that's ever been validated, the only part that's ever been seen, so they inflate that mask until it's everything that exists. Because they've learned through years of repeated experience that the true self, the legitimate emotional needs, the real vulnerabilities, these things are not acceptable. They're not lovable. They're not valid. Only the mask matters. Only performance matters. Only the image matters. And now you have the basic structure of narcissism. A person who's learned that their emotional survival depends on maintaining an inflated image of perfection, success, specialness. Because that was the only version of them that was ever loved. Jung saw this with such clarity. He wrote, "The child is driven to live not his own life, but the unlived life of the parents." And think about the devastating depth of that phrase, not your own life. The unlived life of the parents. You're not living, you're compensating. You're not being, you're fulfilling. You're not existing as yourself. You're existing as the solution to their emotional void. And here's what makes all of this so difficult to identify, so difficult to escape. On the surface, this dynamic can seem like love. It can seem like care. It can seem like investment. The parents are present. The parents are involved, the parents are attentive, but the quality of that attention is fundamentally toxic, because it's not attention to what you really are. It's attention to what they need you to be. It's not investment in your true development. It's investment in their projection. It's not unconditional love. It's intensely conditional love disguised as care. And the child grows up confused, because they can't name what's wrong, because technically the parents are doing everything right. They're present, they're involved, they're investing. How can they complain? How can they say they're suffering when they should be grateful? So they internalize the guilt. They assume the problem is with them. She decides she needs to try harder, to perform better, to be more perfect. And the cycle deepens. Carl Jung identified 3 specific signs of this dynamic. 3 markers that you can look back on in your own childhood and recognize. First, you were never seen for who you really were. You were seen for what you represented to them. When you brought home an achievement, your parents' reaction wasn't curiosity about your experience. It was pride about what it said about them as parents. When you expressed difficult emotions, the reaction wasn't empathy. It was discomfort, irritation, or worse, punishment. Because your real emotions got in the way of the fantasy they needed to maintain. Second, you learned that vulnerability was dangerous, that emotional needs were weakness, that asking for help was failure. Not because your parents said this explicitly, but because every time you showed real vulnerability, you were subtly punished, ignored, minimized, or worse, made to feel like you were disappointing them. So you learned to hide, learned to perform strength even when you were falling apart, learned that the mask was safer than the truth. Third, you became responsible for your parents' emotional well-being. This is massive. This is the central mechanism in a healthy family. The parents are responsible for the kiddo's emotional well-being. In this toxic dynamic, it's reversed. The child becomes responsible for making the parents feel good about themselves, for validating the parents' fantasy, for compensating for the parents' emotional void. And you may not have realized this happening. You may not have had words to describe it. But if you look back, you'll see the patterns. You'll see how you learn to read their moods, to manage their emotions, to modulate your own behavior to keep them regulated, because you learned, before you even had language for it, that your emotional survival depended on keeping them okay. This is emotional parentification, and it's devastating, because now you carry this pattern into all the relationships in your adult life. You feel responsible for everyone's emotions. You feel guilty when other people are unhappy, even if it has nothing to do with you. You modulate who you are based on who other people need you to be, and you do all this automatically, unconsciously, because you were trained since childhood that this is the only way to be safe in a relationship. Jung saw how this creates narcissists, because when you grow up being treated as an extension instead of a separate person, you don't develop a coherent sense of self. You develop a collection of personas based on what different people need from you. And you become addicted to external validation because you never developed internal validation, because there was never space for you to discover who you really are when you're not serving someone else's needs. And here's the hardest part to accept. Your parents probably didn't do this intentionally. They didn't wake up one day and decide to use you as a narcissistic extension. They did it because it was done to them, because they were also raised in this dynamic, because they also never had space to develop a true self, separate from their parents' projections. It's an intergenerational pattern, a cycle that repeats through entire families, through entire generations, because no one ever stopped to do the painful work of recognizing and breaking that pattern. Jung knew this. He wrote extensively about how unresolved traumas, unprocessed projections, unaddressed patterns, they don't disappear. They are passed on, transmitted to the next generation, and the next, and the next, until someone says enough, until someone does the work to see the pattern, name the pattern, and consciously choose not to replicate it. And if you're watching this video, there's a very real possibility that you are that person, the person who's finally going to break the cycle in your family lineage. But to do that, you need to first recognize the dynamic, need to see how it operated on you, need to feel the full extent of the pain it caused, because you can't heal what you can't name. You can't change what you can't see. And here's what Jung would say to you now. You are not your parents. You are not their projection. You are not the fantasy they built on top of you. You are not responsible for compensating for the emotional void they never filled. You are a separate person with a true self that was never completely seen, completely validated, completely allowed to exist. And the work now, the deep work of healing, is to create space for that true self to emerge, not the inflated persona, not the mask you learn to wear to survive, but the real you, vulnerable, imperfect, deeply human, that's been hidden underneath it all. Jung called this process individuation. It's the process of becoming who you really are, separate from who you were conditioned to be. It's painful. It's terrifying. Because it means letting go of the only version of you that's ever been validated, means confronting the emptiness that you've spent your whole life trying to fill through performance, through achievement, through proving your worth. It means feeling all the emotions you were never allowed to feel, all the anger you had to swallow, all the sadness you had to hide, all the need you had to deny. But on the other side of that process is something you've never experienced. The possibility of existing as yourself, without having to constantly prove you deserve to be here. The possibility of relationships based on real connection instead of transactional exchange. The possibility of love that isn't conditioned on performance. And if you have kids, or are thinking of having kids, the most important work you can do is this. Break the cycle. See them as separate people with legitimate emotional needs instead of extensions of yourself. Create space for them to be who they really are instead of who you need them to be, to validate your own unresolved insecurities. Because that's the only way to stop the intergenerational transmission of this pattern. The only way to guarantee that your kids don't spend the next 3 decades trying to recover the true self that was never allowed to exist. Jung believed deeply in the human capacity for transformation. He saw this capacity not as optional, but as the essential work of the second half of life, confronting everything that was unresolved in the first half, recovering everything that was lost, denied, suppressed. And for folks raised in this toxic family dynamic, this work begins with a simple yet devastating truth. You were used, you were instrumentalized. Your entire childhood was structured around serving the unresolved emotional needs of people who should have been serving yours. This isn't your fault. You didn't cause this, you couldn't have avoided it, you were a kiddo. But now you're an adult, and now you have a choice. You can continue replicating this pattern, passing this dynamic onto the next generation, perpetuating the cycle because it's all you know. Or would you can do the brutally difficult work of breaking this pattern, of healing this wound, of finally allowing the true self that's been suppressed your entire life to have space to exist. Carl Jung knew this choice isn't easy. He knew that most people choose the familiarity of repetition over the terror of the unknown. But he also knew that for some of us, the repetition becomes so insurmountable that the terror of the unknown starts to seem preferable. If you've reached that point, if you're feeling like you can't live this way anymore, then you're ready for the real work, the work of individuation, the work of becoming separate, the work of reclaiming the self that was lost to serve the unresolved parental projections of other people, according to Jung. And this work changes everything, not overnight, not magically, but slowly. Through years of conscious practice, you start to feel the difference between living your own life and living the unlived life of your parents. You start to feel the difference between external validation that always leaves you empty and internal validation that finally allows you to rest. You start to feel the difference between relationships based on mutual use and relationships based on seeing and being seen as you really are. And for the first time in your life, you start to experience something you didn't even know was possible, the sensation of being at home in your own self, not in the inflated persona, not in the mask, but in the true, imperfect, vulnerable, deeply human self that was waiting all along to finally be allowed to exist. Let me show you how this dynamic manifests in concrete situations that you've probably experienced, but never been able to name. You're 6 years old. You come home from school with a drawing you made. You're excited because for the first time, you've managed to draw a house with perspective. You show it to your mom, and instead of curiosity about what you learned, about how you felt making this drawing, about the creative process you went through, she immediately grabs the drawing and shows it to the neighbor saying, "Look how talented my kiddo is. Look what a great mom I am." You don't realize it in that moment, but something inside you registers. My achievement isn't about me, it's about validating her. My worth isn't in what I experienced, it's in what it says about her. And this repeats hundreds of times, thousands of times, until it becomes the way you understand your own worth. You're 12 years old, you get a bad grade in math, you come home afraid. not afraid of math, afraid of your parents' reaction. And when you tell them, they don't ask if you're struggling, if you need help, what's going on. They get furious, ashamed. How could you do this to them? How could you embarrass them like this? What will the other parents think? And again, something inside you registers. My difficulty isn't about me needing support. It's about me having failed to protect their image. My suffering doesn't matter. What matters is how this makes them look. You're 16 years old. You're thinking about what career to pursue. You like art. You like writing. You like creating things. But your parents have other plans. They want you to be a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer. Something respectable. Something they can mention in conversations. Something that compensates for the fact that they didn't achieve those careers for themselves. And when you try to express what you really want, they don't listen. They explain why you're wrong. They convince you that what you want isn't realistic, isn't practical, isn't safe. But beneath all this rationalization is a much simpler truth. What you want doesn't serve their emotional needs, and your emotional needs don't matter as much as theirs. So you bury what you really want. You choose the career they want, and you spend the next 2 decades feeling empty, disconnected, living a life that technically is yours, but that never felt like yours, because it isn't. It's their unlived life. Carl Jung saw this repeatedly in his patients, people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, successful by any external metric, but profoundly unhappy, living lives that look right on paper, but feel completely wrong inside. And when he started to explore, it always came back to the same dynamic. These people were never allowed to discover who they really were, separate from their unresolved parental projections. They became what they needed to be, to maintain their parents' love. And now, decades later, they're trapped living this inflated persona, unable to even imagine who they could be without it. And here's what makes the narcissism created by this dynamic particularly difficult to heal. The person doesn't even realize it is narcissism because they don't feel grandiose. They feel empty. They don't feel superior. They feel fraudulent. They don't lack empathy because they're evil. They lack empathy because they never received empathy. So they don't have an internal model of how it works. The narcissism created by this family dynamic isn't the obvious narcissism you see in movies. It's the covert narcissism, the vulnerable narcissism. The person who presents as successful but is constantly on the edge of collapse. The person who helps everyone else but never allows anyone to really see them. The person who seems to have it all together but is secretly crumbling inside. Jung had a term for this: compensatory psychic inflation. The inflated persona isn't really about arrogance. It's about compensating for a deep sense of not being enough. It's about trying to fill through external achievements, the internal void that was never filled through unconditional love. And you can spend your entire life trapped in this cycle, conquering more, achieving more, proving more, and never, ever feeling like it's enough. Because you're not really trying to be enough for yourself. You're trying to be enough to fill the emotional void that your parents projected onto you decades ago. Jung believed that recognizing this pattern is the first step, but recognition alone doesn't heal you. You need to do the active work of separating yourself, and this work has specific stages. First, grief. You need to allow yourself to feel the loss of what you never had, the childhood you should have had but didn't, the parents you needed but didn't have, the true self that should have had space to develop but didn't. This grief is painful. It's anger. It's sadness. It's a deep sense of injustice, and you need to feel it all. Because you can't let go of what you can't recognize that you've lost. Second, anger. And not the performative anger you're already used to feeling. The deep, visceral, legitimate anger for what was done to you, because something was done to you. You were used, you were instrumentalized, your childhood was stolen to serve emotional needs that should never have been yours to carry. And you have a right to that anger. You have a right to feel that it was unfair. Because it was, and until you allow that anger to exist, it's going to continue leaking out through passive-aggressive patterns, through toxic relationships, through unconscious self-sabotage. Third, separation. This is the most terrifying stage, because it means letting go of the only version of you that's ever been validated. It means confronting the terror of not knowing who you are without the persona. It means existing in the temporary void between who you were conditioned to be and who you really are. Jung called this the dark night of the soul. It's the stage where you've let go of the mask, but haven't yet discovered the face underneath. It's uncomfortable, it's terrifying, and most people give up here. They go back to the familiarity of the persona because at least it's known. But if you can get through this stage, if you can tolerate the discomfort of not knowing, something extraordinary starts to happen. You start to feel impulses, interests, desires that aren't about compensating for anything, that aren't about proving anything, that aren't about validating anything, that simply are. And these impulses, these interests, these desires, these are the first signs of the true self starting to emerge. Fourth, reconstruction. Now you begin the work of building a life based on who you really are instead of who you were conditioned to be. This doesn't mean throwing everything away. Some things in your life built on the persona may actually be aligned with your true self, but many things won't be, and you're going to need the courage to let go of relationships, careers, identities that no longer serve who you're becoming. And here is where the work gets really difficult. Because the people in your life who benefited from your persona will resist. They'll tell you that you've changed, that you're not yourself anymore. And they're right. You're not the version of you that served their needs anymore. You're becoming the version of you that is real. Fifth, integration. This is the stage that Jung considered the ultimate goal of psychological work. It's not about eliminating the persona completely. It's about integrating it consciously. Using the mask when it's useful but not being enslaved by it. Being able to perform social roles when necessary, but not forgetting that they are roles. It's the ability to move fluently between the social self and the private self without losing the sense of who you really are. It's the freedom to choose consciously how you present yourself instead of being unconsciously trapped in a specific presentation. And now, after years of this work, you finally experience something that you've never had, the sensation of being real, not perfect, not always successful, not constantly validated, but real, authentically, vulnerably, deeply real. And in that reality, you discover something surprising: true connection. Because when you stop performing and start being, you create space for others to stop performing too. And for the first time, you experience relationships based not on mutual use, not on transactional validation, but on seeing and being seen, on knowing and being known, on loving and being loved, not for what you do, but for who you are. If this content is resonating deeply with you, if you're recognizing your own story in these words, consider supporting this work through super thanks. This support allows me to continue creating deep psychological content that goes beyond superficiality and really helps people to understand and transform their most fundamental patterns. Every contribution, no matter the size, allows me to dedicate more time to this work of translating deep psychology into accessible language. And it means that this type of content can reach more people who desperately need these tools to heal. But back to our theme. Jung believed that this toxic family dynamic, the one that creates narcissism through unresolved parental projections, it's not inevitable, it's not genetic, it's not fate, it's a learned pattern. And what was learned can be unlearned. But unlearning requires something very specific, a witness. You can't do this work alone. You need at least one person, whether it's a therapist, whether it's a deeply conscious friend, whether it's a partner committed to real growth, someone who can see you, really see you, not the persona, not the mask, not the projection, but you. And in that being seen, something starts to heal, because the original trauma was being invisible. It was being seen only as an extension, only as a vehicle for others' needs. So the healing comes through being seen as you really are, without needing to perform, without needing to compensate, without needing to prove, just existing. And being seen in that existence and being accepted in that existence, Jung called this the transcendent function. It's when the presence of another conscious person allows you to integrate parts of yourself that you had to exile. It's when you can finally bring the true self into the light, because there's someone there who won't reject it, won't instrumentalize it, won't use it. Someone who will simply see it. And this is the most important work that you can do, not for your parents. They may never understand. They may never recognize what they did. They may never validate your experience. And that's okay. You're not doing this work to change them. You're doing this work to free you, and you're doing this work to break the cycle, to ensure that if you have kids, or if you work with kids, or if you influence children in any way, you don't pass on this pattern. You don't use them as extensions. You don't project your unfulfilled dreams onto them. You don't make them responsible for your emotional well-being. You see them as separate individuals with legitimate needs, with true selves that deserve the space to exist, and you create the environment that you never had, an environment where being real is safe, where vulnerability is accepted, where worth is inherent rather than conditional. That is the real cycle breaker. It's not just about healing yourself, but ensuring the next generation doesn't need to heal from what you passed on to them. Jung would say this is your essential task, your life's work, not to conquer more, not to achieve more, not to prove more, but to become real, to reclaim the self that was lost, and to create space for others to be real too. And when you finally do that, when you finally break free from this toxic dynamic that created generations of narcissism in your family line, you discover something profound. You were always enough, always valid, always worthy. Not because you achieved anything, not because you proved anything, not because you compensated for anything, but simply because you exist, and your existence always was, always has been, always will be enough.